Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the Florida Food Policy Council's monthly Florida Food Forum, hosted by the Policy Committee of the Council. I am Del Deschamps, co-chair of the committee. Jennifer Parker is our co-chair, and she is away for this session. With us from the Council is the Council's administrative assistant, who you've heard a few words from already, and that's Kendra Love. Kendra will be handling the technical and managerial aspects of our meeting, as you've already noticed. I'm also asking Kendra to let us all know when the session will close and give us an alert when we have about 5 minutes left. For now, this month's topic is an extremely important one for these times, and one that many would recognize as critically urgent for this moment: equity in the food system. The topic intersects issues in ethics, oppression, and systemic cultural marginalization of minority communities. If you're not already familiar with how food policy relates to these issues, today we'll offer foundational insights and knowledge. If you are already informed on these issues, the session will expand and deepen your understanding. Thanks as always for joining us. A document introducing our presenter for today is posted on the Council's blog site. And if you registered for the event, you have seen the introduction. I do encourage you to take a look at it again. Today, we welcome Candace Spencer to leadership of this month's forum. Candace comes to us with a rich background in social and environmental justice. Her professional career witnesses a deep and abiding commitment to the ideals of conservation, community engagement, and healing of ecologies of nature and economics. We are honored to have her with us. Candace holds a BA in Environmental Science and a Juris Doctorate, both from the University of Florida. A particular interest to food policy activists is her development of the Conservation Clinic that focuses on urban agriculture policy through the lens of environmental justice and economic development. You can find much more information about Candace's background on the Florida Food Policy Council's blog for today's event. Following her presentation will be an opportunity for questions and discussion. And before going further, I want to invite everyone here today to consider joining the Florida Food Policy Council. You will find information about membership on our website. And as I turn things over to Candace, I'm asking that she tell us a little bit about herself and what inspired her to take leadership in this important area of our food system and our culture as a whole. And so with pleasure, we welcome Candace Spencer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am really excited to be here. A little bit nervous, I'm not gonna lie, but very much excited. Thank you, Del, for the introduction, and thank you, Kendra, for making sure this all runs smoothly. That is critically important because technology can go wrong at any point in time, as we know. So to expound upon Del's introduction of myself, as he mentioned, I'm an attorney. I did practice environmental law with an emphasis on food and ag. I'm a proud Double Gator. I rep that very hard, although I'm now based in Washington, D.C., doing agriculture policy. And what got me, that's a really good question as far as what has inspired me to dedicate my life to this work. And it's the fact that food is a universal need. It crosses any type of barrier people would put in place between other people, whether it be race, class, gender, sexual orientation. Like food, everyone needs food, everyone needs to eat. And establishing equity in that area is a really great way to advance equity in our society overall. And equity and justice are what matter deeply to me. And that is why I've dedicated my career and my life to this work. A little bit more background, as Del mentioned, I did work at the University of Florida Conservation Clinic. I developed our Environmental Justice and Community Economic Development Program area, where we focused on local food policy, heiress property, which is an area that intersects with equity and Black land ownership. And I also got the chance to teach an environmental justice class for our clinic students and had a really great experience there. I have some strong ties to Gainesville still, although as I mentioned, I'm now in DC. I'm a board member of Working Food based in Gainesville, which runs a commercial kitchen, a seed saving program, a youth gardens program, and a community space for meetings and events. I've been a member of the Florida Food Policy Council since 2016. I got involved as a law student because they were doing policy. I was in law school. I wanted to see what was going on and what it was about, and I've had a great time ever since. I'm really grateful to still be able to be involved, although I no longer live in the state. I'm also an avid baker. That was my first introduction to food systems, any type of thinking about food and its importance, because I love to bake and to show love to people in the form of baked goods. And that has informed my perspective on food as love and food as a cultural connection and a way of advancing equity. I want to go ahead and lay out the focus for the presentation today to begin to center racial equity in the food system through policy. And the part of this may seem obvious, but I want to clarify a few things. Equity is a huge topic and undertaking. There's no way to cover everything in an hour. So I want to begin the conversation, to begin the understanding or to further understanding, to start planting questions and ideas in people's heads about how to bring this work to their work. So it's the beginning of a conversation. It's not going to be the end all be all. I also focus on racial equity. There's a lot of different ways to approach equity in the food system. My lens today is racial equity. And obviously through policy, because this is the Florida Food Policy Council, and as a lawyer, I see high value in using policy to advance equity. So I'm going to start out with some history. I am fascinated by looking at people and systems and wondering how they got to be the way they are. And the only way to know that is to look at history. So if we look at the history of the food and ag system in this country, it is based on two things: stolen land and stolen labor. As most people know from just basic history class, there were millions of indigenous people living in this land before colonists came to this country. Those indigenous people were systematically decimated, removed, and relocated from land they had occupied for centuries. Additionally, on stolen land, so in order to have a successful agricultural system, let me back up a little bit. You need land and you need capital, also known as labor. Land was stolen from indigenous people, and labor was stolen from enslaved African people who were brought to this country to work the land and to utilize it for the economic benefit of white people. That economic benefit was estimated by political scientist Thomas Kramer to be between $5.9 and $14.2 trillion in today's dollars. These two things didn't happen in a vacuum and weren't the result of just individual discrimination or racist ideas. These things were supported and upheld by policy, because policy is often a tool of systemic racism. Some examples include treaties with indigenous people that were either weren't explained very well, weren't translated to indigenous people, completely ignored the concept of land ownership and what that means for indigenous people, if that term even existed, or they just weren't followed. Whatever treaties were agreed to, quote unquote, agreed to or signed were completely broken by the federal government. Another example is the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed people to go out and claim certain tracts of land. And if they worked it for 5 years, they were able to maintain ownership of that land. This was only available to white people, not to the Black people that were living in this country, not to indigenous people, strictly only to white people. And that land ownership has provided generational wealth that is present to this day. The Farm Bill, which is a huge part of ag policy here in this country and is federal legislation, also was a tool to oppose systemic racism, and to some extent still is. A notable way in which it upheld systemic racism was by delegating a lot of decision-making power to states and countries in the implementation of Farm Bill programs. That's important to note because something can either implicitly or explicitly oppose systemic racism. And because this systemic racism is so prevalent, if something is not actively opposing it, it is implicitly upholding it. So the Farm Bill allowed states and counties to make the decision over who received loans from the federal government, who had access to land, who had access to federal programs, and that control was used to discriminate, especially in the South, against Black farmers. So leading into the present day, these things still have long-lasting effects. According to the 2017 Ag Census, that is conducted by the USDA, 95% of agricultural producers in this country are white. 1.4% of producers in this country are Black. And the average white household owns 86 times more wealth than its Black counterpart and 68 times more wealth than its Latino one. And that goes back to, at the beginning of this country, who was able to access the things that created wealth, like land, and obviously money, and those were white people. With this information, the question is then, okay, so now what? Now we know, what do we do with this information? What do we do with this knowledge? As they say in AA, acknowledgement is the first step to getting help. And as I say, acknowledgement is the first step to righting wrong. Something that is critical in moving equity forward is to acknowledge, and to not just acknowledge, but accept the fact that this system is built on structural inequity. It's not enough just to say that something may have been racist back then, or maybe something is unintentionally racist or inequitable. We have to acknowledge that this was what the system was built on, and that would always be the foundation. In order to change that foundation, we have to acknowledge that reality. In this context, we're talking about policy. And so applying this knowledge to policy and moving equity forward in policy, you have to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time. This first question is going to be why. Why is this policy the way it is? And I'm thinking about this in two different contexts, to say, if we have a policy that already exists that we're trying to make more equitable, or if we have a new policy that we're trying to make sure it's equitable from its inception. So the question is, why is this policy the way it is? That goes more to an existing policy. I told my students at the clinic, you have to ask why until you get to the very root of the answer. You can't just ask why one time and be satisfied with that answer. My example is that Black children are less likely to read at their grade level than white children. And for Alachua County, this is absolutely true. There was a report that came out, I believe, 2 years ago that analyzed the educational gap between Black and white children in Alachua County, and how I believe it's the highest in the state of Florida. And so the question, is why? Why is this the case? One answer you may get is because a direct correlation to success in education is access to proper nutrition. And as it turns out, Black children are less likely to have access to proper nutrition than white children. Okay, why? Because Black children tend to live in areas where there is not as many places to buy fresh, healthy food. Okay, why? If you keep asking why, it gets you to redlining, to discrimination in housing loans, into white flight, into policies that undergird discrimination in housing that have led to concentrations of communities that lack the infrastructure that other communities that are not of color, that are white communities, have. If you just stopped at the first why, it doesn't get you to the full deepness of what is actually going on and what has led to the state that you see before you. And that goes back to understanding that you're always going to get to inequity if you keep asking why, because that's what the system is built on. And to change any system or structure, you have to know how it came to be in the first place by asking why. I think the next question is what? What does it mean for a policy to be equitable? If we know why it's inequitable, what does it then mean to change that policy? And the best question is, does it shift power? Does this policy, this program, this idea, does it shift power from those who have it to those who don't? If it doesn't, it's not advancing equity. That's the basic definition. Does it shift power? So this existing policy, does it shift power? This idea for a policy, does it shift power? This idea for a program, will it shift power? That is the baseline to evaluate if, at the beginning, if something's going to be equitable. But in order to know if it shifts power, you're going to have to ask who. Centering equity in policy cannot be done without the input of those who don't have power. You're going to have to ask people, we have to ask people who are impacted, who don't have power, what that looks like for them to have power in this particular context, in this particular way, with this particular idea. What I have often seen happen in policy, and this completely predates me in my involvement in policy, is that we have an idea that we think is really, really awesome. We develop it and then we take it to people who are impacted and ask for their buy-in. Not necessarily their feedback, but their buy-in to say that they think it's a good idea or not. And we are often dismayed, upset, and hurt if people don't want to engage with it. But they weren't involved in the beginning of the process. They weren't involved in the idea and the creation to say, this is not going to help me. This is not going to give me the power that I am looking for. This is not an idea that's worth putting forward if your goal is to center equity. Engaging people who don't have power to get their genuine, honest feedback into what is going to help them get power, which is what is going to give them power through policy, requires intentional, respectful, and lengthy relationship building. One of my mentors told me the phrase moving at the speed of trust, which I think is super helpful. I know for the federal level with Congress, it's usually a breakneck speed of getting things through all at once, all of a sudden. And that doesn't often leave room for thoughtful engagement of those who are impacted and thoughtful analysis of what a policy is going to mean for those who are impacted. Building a new system is going to require time. Building an equitable one didn't happen overnight. That took time from the founding of the first ideas of racial inferiority to the system that we see before us today. Like that took hundreds of years to evolve and to systematize and be ingrained in our society. It will take time to build a new system structured around equity and centered on equity. The next question is going to be how. And this is the question that most people land on of, okay, with all this information, how do we do this? What does this look like for us? And my answer is that there's so many ways. There are so many ways to do this because it is context dependent. What I think is of the most value is to have that baseline, that acknowledgement of inequity, that acceptance of inequity, a willingness to ask those questions and to hear the real answers of the what, the why, the who, and to then apply that to the context you are looking at. I know, so for example, in Gainesville, they are doing the community feedback process for the urban ag ordinance that I actually had a chance to work on. So the questions there would be in getting feedback would be, does that shift power? Does that shift power, engaging communities who are going to be impacted by that to see their feedback on that? That's a potentially different process than at the federal level if I'm looking at how to move forward an idea for a crop insurance policy that's going to be equitable in a way that's different from how crop insurance currently works. I work on crop insurance, so that's my area of focus currently. But I think it's context dependent, but with a basic understanding and a basic foundation of the things that I've just talked about. Something I would like to challenge us to do here with the FLFPC and the orgs we represent are to do internal work to make sure as staff organizations, as members of FLFPC, we are not unintentionally advancing inequity in systems by not evaluating our own selves. In the organization I work in now, we're doing this work to look at internally our workplace culture, our processes, our staff. How are we subscribing to white supremacy culture in ourselves? Because if we can't do that work internally, it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to advance equity in any other place if we can't do it within our own workplace. So with the council and with the orgs we work on, I challenge us to do that internal work as well, in addition to doing outreach or doing the work to externally create policies that are equitable. So as I said, you cannot cover equity in an hour. So what I want to leave people with is a lot of resources that I have found are helpful, that I've been told are helpful to both understand the history of this and then tools for moving forward. So a few of the books I have listed here are amazing. Lies My Teacher Told Me is a wonderful book that looks at the history, the reality of history in this country and the things that are left out when you learn it in school. Similarly, The Indigenous Peoples' History of the U.S. tells history of the U.S. through the eyes of people who did not benefit from the presence of colonists here in this country and from the formation of the United States. Dr. Kendi's book is fantastic in sharing how racist ideas came to be. The idea of racial inferiority did not exist always. It is definitely something that was made up to justify a system that was inhumane, that existed for the economic benefit of white people. And his book covers the idea of how that came to be in this country. Additionally, everyone here obviously wanted to hear about this topic and cares about this topic. At the same time, it can be hard for people to understand why it's important to talk about racism, why it matters, and be willing to have those difficult conversations. It is uncomfortable to talk about. And Robin DiAngelo's book is also a really great resource to help people kind of work through that uncomfortability. Trainings as well are also super important and valuable. This work is never ending and is ongoing. So the more you can learn and grow and the more tools you have, the better you can advance equity in the food system. Race Forward has some amazing racial justice trainings. Soulfire Farm, and the Race Forward actually also travels in their trainings. So you can look on their website and see where and when there is one closest to you to attend. Soulfire Farm has an Uprooting Racism in the Food System training. They are based in New York, but also willing to travel. I'm sure they'd be happy to come to sunny Florida in the winter. And then Equity at Work also does trainings for building equitable and inclusive organizations, and we've used some of their resources in the job I currently hold. Rounding it out to policy and food justice, there are some examples of policy platforms and organizations that are doing great work to center equity that can be models, resources, and case studies. Heal Food Alliance has a platform for real food. Soulfire Farm has food sovereignty action steps. The organization New Roots in Lexington, Kentucky is headed up by my mentor, Karen Moskowitz. She and this organization are a great example of how to do equity as a white-led organization. And she was actually in Gainesville a few weeks ago to do some conversations and to share and to hear from people in the Gainesville food system. And then to keep it local to the state of Florida, Farm Worker Association of Florida, Agricultural Justice Project, and Coalition of Immokalee Workers do amazing work centering equity in the food system by centering the voices of those who tend to be left out of the conversation, like farm workers. And with that, I thank you all for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, Kendra, you opening up the contacts for all who are listening?
Yes, so for anyone who would like to ask a question, if you have dialed in with your phone, you can unmute yourself by pushing the star and then number 6. If you have come onto the meeting through the link online, you can unmute yourself using the microphone button located at the bottom of the screen. We do have one question from Rebecca Bray. She asked Candace if you could repeat what you said about the implicit and explicit equity. What exactly is that?
Sure. And I'm going to turn my camera on so everyone can actually see my face as well. I'm happy to go back to any slides anyone didn't catch. And so what I believe Rebecca is referring to is this idea that, or the reality that if the system is built on inequity, structural inequity, if you're not actively opposing it, you're implicitly upholding it. There's no way to be neutral in the topic of equity. It's either you're for it or without action, or you're for it explicitly, or without action, you're for it, and it may be unintentionally. And so it's not just being quote unquote racist or not racist, it's being racist and anti-racist, to actively act against the structure of racism that exists.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is this. If you just look at the population of the state of Florida, and I think it's about 16% Black, 17% is Cuban. I think that's the largest minority in the state of Florida. How do you get equity when you don't have people that are interested in agriculture? How do you promote interest in agriculture to start to get equity? I mean, it's great to divvy up land and to do things like that in a capital resource, but who do you allow to tend until, it's still labor intensive work?
So I think part of your question was people who are interested in agriculture. I think it's worth asking people if they are or are not versus, obviously you're talking about a large population of people. The state of Florida is the 5th largest state in the country. So you're obviously not every single person, but it's worth asking people. if they
It's
are
the
or
third
not.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's people, we don't know until we ask people, but also understanding that ag is not, I talk about ag because I love ag, but ag is also leads to obviously like food consumption. Everyone has got to eat. So everyone has a stake in the food system. And if you ask people, everyone cares about food in some way, whether it's having access to cultural food, whether it's having access to healthy food, regardless of what it is, everyone cares about food. And so understanding what aspect of that people care about and engaging them in the way it's going to be most meaningful to them. And also not assuming and asking when possible if they are interested in ag and what that looks like for them.
Okay, so at this point, we just don't have a plan. Can we start to take a census or something in schools to start to see? Because I have acreage and I'm willing to open it up for sharecropping and different things like that, but it's a lack of interest, you know, at the basic foundation. If you look at Detroit, they've started to reclaim a lot of the old lots. 10,000 houses were destroyed in, I think, 6 months or a year, something like that. And they're reclaiming that as green space. But how do you get people interested? The younger generation just doesn't seem interested in anything labor intensive, especially when you're looking at Florida with 100 degrees plus in the summertime.
So to make sure I understand your question of how you personally have a space to engage people in agriculture and you're wondering how to get people involved in that.
Well, I'm trying to go ahead and get it in a situation to whereas we know who wants to be involved before we start doing programs that nobody's interested in.
Okay, and by we, you have an organization or you personally?
I'm running for Congress for District 17 that's currently occupied by Stube. So what I'm trying to do, since I live in Central Florida in Polk County, which is the largest orange producing county in the state, but we're getting greening, we're getting rot, we're getting, you know, all kinds of different diseases that are destroying it. I'm trying to go ahead and look into programs that not only promote phytorestoration, so cleaning the land through planting, but I also would like to have an idea of who's actually interested in doing this. You know, you can be as, you know, gung-ho as you want to be, but if other people aren't even interested, I'm just trying to figure out a way to gauge the interest, because as you had stipulated, what was it, 1.4% of minorities are involved in agriculture, as opposed to 96%. I can't remember your exact statistics from earlier, but I mean, it was a paltry sum. So I love the idea of promoting equity, but who do you promote it to if you don't have the general population's interest?
Yeah, so I would recommend looking to see what organizations are involved in your area that do this kind of work. My parents are from Polk County, actually. And I'm thinking it's not Polk County, it's Orlando, so more like Orange County, but like that Central Florida area does have a lot of organizations that do work around food and ag, and they're going to have access to membership and to people who are doing this kind of work, who care about this kind of work. So I would look at organizations in the area that have access to people who are interested to see what their take is and if they have ideas for how to connect with people there.
Okay, so just start from ground zero. I just thought that you had some insight. You work in Washington, you work on some of the ag policy and different things. So I was just kind of, you know, fishing for ideas from that aspect.
Can you hear me? Am I live on the line right now, Kendra?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Candace, can you hear me too?
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay, sure. Let me just weigh in on this briefly. I think, and since you're running for Congress, I would suggest that at least some research be done into the USDA budget and the allocation of funds specifically for urban agriculture and for projects that are designed to engage low-income, low-access communities, specifically food deserts within urban areas and economically disadvantaged rural areas for specifically the purpose of encouraging small farms and including economic incentives from the USDA. That's
exactly what I want. Yeah.
There is an enormous amount of federal funding that goes simply to feeding operations. To divert even a small portion of that for direct funding of urban agriculture as well as small-scale rural agriculture would make a world of difference. So much of our resources devoted simply to feeding operations and not enough to incentivize agriculture activities. If that was done, and if you're in a position to do it in Congress, or if any of us are in a position to advocate with USDA for a redistribution of some of those feeding dollars into direct food production activity, a world of difference would be made.
Yep. That's what I'm most interested in, because as I'm seeing, a lot of people from the coast are moving from the coast to inland, and I'm trying to conserve that land before it's destroyed through sprawl, and get it so that you are incentivized to break up your large plots into, not, I hate to say tenant farming or sharecropping because that has a negative connotation to it, but just mutual beneficial efforts. You know, that's truly what I'm looking for. And I don't have a choice whether or not people want me to lead. They either look at my ideas and say, hey, he seems like an honest guy, or they like, he's a crackpot. You know, I'm just out here trying to make as much of a difference as I possibly can.
Okay, thank you.
We do have 2 comments. Natalia mentioned possibly looking into future farmers or the Florida Farm Bureau as a resource. And then we also had a comment that people working in agriculture, maybe they don't make enough money, so they're not motivated. Many immigrants are underpaid to do agricultural work, and if they earn better salaries, they would be more motivated. A lot of young people are interested in producing their own food. We also had another comment, land conservation grants could be used to protect for agricultural use. So thanks everyone for leaving comments.
Was I to respond to that, or am I to just be quiet now? I don't, I have a couple of just the responses to that. I wanted to create a forum where people could send their information so that we could use, you know, communal activity and get people connected with landowners that are willing to go ahead and allow their lands to be used for harvesting, for planting and growing, and make a community development system.
So the gentleman's comment about the Office of Urban Ag has me thinking about other grant programs USDA offers. As a heads up, the Office of Urban Ag is still very much getting underway and only just got funding, but there has been rumors that they'll be submitting out requests for applications for funding coming up this spring. So if you are interested in that, be on the lookout for that, because that would be a great thing to apply for.
Is there any way that we could keep in contact? Is your information posted? I wasn't positive.
So if you, the best way to keep in touch is actually going to be through the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is the organization I work for. We have member updates, weekly roundup emails where we put out information about RFAs that are going out, program updates, a ton of information about all the USDA programs we work on. So I can share that with Kendra to share afterwards, however this information is going to be shared afterwards. So everyone has access to that.
Okay,
that's because you do have a heads up.
Whoa, that was a lot of people.
Yeah, we will be posting this forum on our website, and we'll make sure to include all the contact information that Candace provides us with, so you're able to follow up with her after.
Thank you, Kendra. And Candace, make sure that you give us a hot link or a hyperlink specifically to the organization that you work with that supplies the updates on urban agriculture funding through the federal government, specifically USDA. I think that would be very, very valuable, both to our caller as well as to the general public. One note that I'll have on this, and Candace, you can weigh in on this as well. In my experience in working with USDA grants, that it's the grant, and again, I'm asking for your professional insight on this. It seems that the grants are relatively limited, and that the organizations that get the grants tend to be much larger, already well-funded or well-organized either government entities or large, well-funded, not-for-profit organizations. It seems like the smaller organizations and small farmer collectives, especially in urban environments, just don't have a chance to get a shot at that money. Can you further comment on that from your experience?
Sure. I think it depends on which grant programs you're referring, like which grant programs we're looking at as far as who is getting that funding. I will say overall data on program recipients isn't always readily available. And it can be, if it is available, it's kind of hard to weed through. We do that work at our organization for the programs that we work on, like BFRDP, VAPG, and other programs like that. But it depends on which ones you're looking at. Some of our members are smaller and have gotten grants from the USDA easily and repeatedly, but it depends on what the grants are for and what the program is for. I will say urban ag and things like that, that office just was established in the Farm Bill, in the 2018 Farm Bill. So programs or projects like that may have been hard to get funding up until recently. But overall, with USDA funding, it depends on the program and depends on the purpose.
So would you have more information? Oh, I'm sorry.
You go ahead, brother.
Oh, I apologize, sir. I didn't mean to overspeak you. But the thing that I'm most interested in and what I wanted to bring to District 17 was a communal district grant writer and person that proposed grants, because that amount of money is just, I mean, it's phenomenal. And people leave it on the table all of the time. So that is my biggest proposal for District 17, is to get a position for grants that everyone has access to. So people like Candace would be a wonderful asset in order to help us out, because, you know, there's a pool of money there. And I just want it to go to the people that actually need it, not the ones that are looking to, you know, invest it somewhere else and make even more money off of that money. So I would like to stay in contact, I guess, is what I'm going with anyone who has insight and helpful ideas for grants.
Kendra, it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat again.
Yes, so it looks like we had another question from Caitlin, which was, how can we address inequality in our Florida food system through policy that addresses inequality in the immigrant workforce our state ag relies on so heavily?
And she had an earlier question, she had two other questions as well. I think the first one is, what is the Florida Food Policy Council doing internally to engage in anti-racist work in their staffing? And then how can policy shape some forms of reparations for Black Americans by giving access to ownership of parts of the food system?
So lots of good questions. I guess I will address the Florida food policy, what we're doing internally. So as of right now, we have not yet taken intentional actions, but thank you, Candace, for bringing this up. I think this is something important that we also need to look at. And because this is such an important thing to consider, this is definitely something that we need to evaluate in our own organization. And Candace, would you like to answer the other questions?
I can take a shot at it. The question of how can policy shape some form of reparations for Black Americans by giving access to ownership of parts of the food system, policy has to be the vehicle for that. Policy was a vehicle for taking away land. Policy is the reason why reparations have not been given in the first place, because taking reparations is the repairing of, like, righting a wrong. And that is going to require some shifting of power and resources, which is not going to be done necessarily voluntarily. But land wasn't given up voluntarily in this country, and policy was a driver of that. So policy is going to be the most important part of even bringing about reparations. At the federal government, reparations, the idea of reparations has been talked about. I want to say Representative Sheila Jackson Lee is the one who introduced a resolution to have a discussion around reparations in the House. And the resolution did pass. That discussion is going to continue and move forward. Where that conversation goes and if that leads to any legislation remains to be seen. But those conversations are at least being had at the congressional level, which is a huge step because Congress has not historically been the vehicle for wide-scale equity in the food in this country, unless pushed to, oftentimes. Caitlin's second question is how to address inequity in the Florida food system through policy, that address inequity in the immigrant workforce when our state relies on ag so heavily. Make sure I understand this question. That is a huge question. Caitlin, I'm going to be honest and say I don't have all the answers. I don't really have most of the answer to that question. The only answer I do have, and it's more of a broad one, is to center the voices of immigrants who are farm workers and farm laborers, something that AJP does really well, our Agricultural Justice Project, Coalition of Immokalee Workers does well, Farm Workers Association of Florida does well, is to center those voices, to hear the perspectives of those workers, and then to fight for policy based on their lived experiences and what they are saying is that important. Even in especially if we talk about relying on ag so much, we have to make that a more sustainable system. Labor from people who are coming to this country who live in fear of being deported or of legal interaction to remove them from this country is not sustainable. As a system, our immigration system for agriculture, like the H-2A program, that's not a sustainable form of providing labor, and it's not a sustainable form of treating people any kind of way who come to this country. And so equity has to be centered there. I do not know how, but I will say organizations doing that work have a much better understanding. So I would look to them and the work that they are doing for some ideas on that. Oh goodness. Kendra, do you mind if I go ahead and answer this other question as well?
Yes, of course. Sydney's question asks, you mentioned that the current Farm Bill still upholds some policies that support inequity. Not too familiar with the bill. Could you provide examples of these and perhaps give actionable steps non-policy connected folks can do to push back against these?
Sure. So I have two examples. One is in the inaction that upholds racial equity, and the other one is more in the action. As people may or may not be aware, the USDA itself is known for being inequitable as a department of the federal government. There have been lawsuits from Black farmers, from women farmers, from Hispanic farmers, alleging discrimination and winning cases of discrimination against the USDA. The USDA has, over time, upheld discrimination through county agencies and the giving of access to programs through county agencies. And so with the Farm Bill, something that is like innocuous on the surface, but is still upholding racial equity is crop insurance, which is what I work on. Crop insurance as a whole appears to have nothing to do with race. It is, you grow something, you insure it. If your crop goes badly, if you have a weather event, you get money from the federal government because of it. Or you get money from your insurance company through the federal government because of it. However, if you're looking at who even has access to land to grow enough that is worth insuring, that's usually white people because of the way land and labor have worked in this country. Totally innocuous on its face, but if you start asking questions and dig into it more, it upholds racial inequity. Not only that, crop insurance is heavily subsidized in this country, so farmers who do have crop insurance are actually not paying the full cost. It's subsidized by taxpayers. And there are a lot of, especially if you're growing commodities like soy, corn, soybean, corn, and wheat, you get paid to grow those. Again, access to that market, access to those crops tends to rest in white farmers who are getting the economic benefit.
I had a question on that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so
with the insurance, wasn't it true that when they had the flooding that none of the crops that were actually in the silos were insured? So there was just huge losses because that wasn't considered crop because it wasn't in the field. It had already been harvested and it sat there. And with the, the tariffs and the trade war, with all of those being piled up and stockpiled because there were no markets, all of that being destroyed, who paid for that and who benefited from it?
So if you're talking about things that have already been harvested, you are correct. That is not covered by crop insurance.
Okay, so that was just wasted product, and that was a loss to the farm. That's my question, because of the massive flooding in the Midwest. I know lots of people lost everything. If you talk about Minnesota and Minneapolis and things like that, a lot of the areas, because of the flooding, it just sat there and rotted in the silos, and there was no one to pay for any of that. So it was still a huge loss. Is that something that you guys are looking to rectify and constitute that as an actual crop insurance, or is it just being left as how it's always been?
I think we might have lost connection with Candace. Just one moment.
I can still hear you, Kendra. I can't hear Candace any longer, and I did hear the voice of one of the callers.
Yeah, Ted Murray. Yeah, that's me.
Ted Murray,
yes,
asking
sir.
about the loss of grains in the Midwest that had already been harvested and were in silos during the flooding.
Yeah, that was a huge burden.
Candace is going to be coming back onto the call in just a minute. Dal, if you would like to share any of your input on the question.
Yeah, sure. I'm not familiar with the way the insurance worked with, or if there was any federal policy on the already harvested materials. I just don't know.
Yeah.
But to follow up on the point that Candace was making, and also to relate to some of our earlier discussion, the presence of industrial agriculture, big ag, in all parts of the federal policy, federal farm policy, as well as state policy for that matter as well, carries a tremendously a powerful influence on public policy. And the various projects that we're talking about, and I think that Candace is working on, are all ones that require greater opportunity for the small farmer, the community farmer, the urban agriculturalist to have input in the decisions that are being made and to have access to the funding that's available, from crop insurance to the opportunity to secure land, to benefit from the offer that I think Ted is making to make properties available. All of that requires kind of an assistance and an awareness that the small farmer, the urban agriculturalist, the community farmer or community gardener simply just doesn't have access to and doesn't have the resources to become engaged in. So as a matter of public policy at both the state level as well as the federal level, an awareness, an upfront awareness of the incredible power that the industrial agriculture system and big ag as a whole has is important to keep up front, and to do all that we can as individuals as well as policy organizations, at least to give opportunity to the smaller farmer and the person that's working, especially in underprivileged, economically distressed areas. So in terms of the overall discussion that we're having, including the ideas about insurance and who gets it, I think to keep that awareness at front of mind is of great importance. So those are my thoughts.
So do you think that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So do you think that an initiative on the local level should be started, since we're getting away from common core ideologies, and we should actually be teaching students, children, future constituents, and always taxpayers on these different traps that we ourselves are just finally starting to realize in our 30s and 40s?
Yeah, absolutely. The importance of education, I think that's the direction that you're moving, or the point that you're making, Ted, is of critical importance. And the absence of that is one of the great hurdles or hindrances that we have to any sort of forward progress. And not just at lower levels of education at elementary and high school, but all the way through the college curriculum. If you ask yourself, for example, what programs are available in the university system of any state, let's say the state of Florida, just because we may be most familiar with that. What is the source of education about agriculture policy in the state of Florida? What is the source of education about farming practices in the state of Florida? Where do you go to get that information? Well, there's only one place that you can go, and that's the land-grant university. That's the University of Florida. All the other parts of the state university system are largely disengaged or uninvolved in agriculture policy and agriculture study. That means that you have a whole cadre of future leaders, professionals, both academic professionals as well as leaders in other fields that are getting education that's devoid of really much awareness of food systems and agriculture policy, unless they happen to be have the benefit of going to the University of Florida and taking programs along those lines. So you're right. There's an enormous blind spot in terms of our awareness of the way the system works and the way the system is structured, including the, as Candace has mentioned, the systemic racism and marginalization of communities in the state. So you're absolutely right. It needs to be included in education from the ground up. Ask yourself, around the state of Florida, for example, how many programs from elementary schools to high schools, countywide programs, have agriculture programs. It was not uncommon to have agriculture programs in high schools around the state of Florida, but today largely they're gone, especially in urban centers where they're probably most needed.
Yeah, I think that goes back to my original query about the fact of how many people are interested. And since they don't even know that they're available, how can you show an interest in something you don't even know that you could pursue? I guess that's my biggest challenge that I'm seeing, whether it was in the AI through USF the other day, or it was in any of the different programs that I've participated in. People don't know what is offered, so they have no idea what they can become. You understand what I'm saying by that?
Yeah, no, your point is well taken, and this is front and center a policy issue. What is the policy of the state of Florida on this? What is the policy of individual counties and school systems? What's the policy of municipalities on this? At what point are we, as a culture, through our government entities, committed education in this area? Absent that sort of commitment, then of course there will be ignorance of what is available and the importance of these systems to our very existence as a culture, as a community, as individuals.
Because when people say, I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. So Candace has rejoined us by phone. I think we have time for about maybe one more question.
I was still talking about the silos, whether or not the FDA was going to actually address that in the future, since it was such a huge problem this past growing season.
That's a good question. I can follow up with you offline about that.
Oh, okay.
Would anyone like to ask Candace a question now that she's back with us?
I'll go ahead and ask one last question then, since there doesn't seem to be a rush of others at this point. Candace, as we bring our session to a close, and I want to just thank you for the tremendous insights, the wonderful presentation, and the terrific answers to the questions as they came up. What would be the one item that you think is most critical for folks that are interested in food policy in the state of Florida? What would be the one action that you would recommend that folks take? What's the best thing we can do?
Get involved in local government.
Okay.
Actually, I'm going to say two things. I'm not going to answer your question fully. I'm going to say two things. One is to get educated to the best extent possible. That doesn't require going to school. It just requires learning and growing and reading and being aware of what's going on around you. But also get involved in local government. I work at the federal level, but I firmly believe in the legitimacy and in some ways supremacy of local systems, of governance, of food, of economics, and the way to impact policy to start at your local level. I found so much value in that when I was in Florida. I still find value in that. The federal level gives me more insight into how it's all connected. But the local level is absolutely where you have so much power, and so start getting involved in local government.
I love that answer. That needs to be put up on the website too. I couldn't agree with you more. That the great opportunities for change do occur at the local level, and some of us that have been involved at the local level, both at county and even at municipal levels, have seen incredible changes occur, and relatively quickly, actually, in the great scheme of things, compared to what happens by trying to work at or through the federal government. I love that. I love that recommendation, Candace, and I underscore that too, not as not on behalf of the Florida Food Policy Council, but just as an individual that's active in this area. And I think that the Food Policy Council probably would underscore it as well. So I want to thank you, Candace, for being with us, for sharing your insight, your vision, and your powerful commitment to justice in the food system. You are an inspiration to us all, and your insights are of extreme value to each and every one of us that's listened. So on behalf of the Florida Food Policy Council, I want to thank everyone for being involved. I want to have Kendra say a word or two about what's coming next, and then I'm going to do a sign-off. So Kendra, if you want to share what's coming next month and any other important information about the council at this time, please do so.
Actually, really quickly, I want to say thank you as well to everyone who came and asked their questions. I really enjoyed this opportunity. And so thank you as well to the Florida Food Policy Council for inviting me, and Kendra for working with me in this as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. And Kendra, any final words for today?
Well, thank you so much, Candace. It was a wonderful forum. Thanks to you. Thanks, everyone, to your questions. Next month, we will be having our March Florida Food Forum. It's the last Friday in March, on March 27th at the same time from 12 to 1 p.m. Our chair, Rachel Shapiro, will be hosting an interactive panel discussion with some of the amazing women that make up the Florida food system. So we do have our event up on our website. It is open for registration. And as we get our panel speakers locked in, we will be updating that information on our Facebook site as well.
Okay, well, great. Thank you, Candace, again, and thank you, Kendra, for that information. I do want to encourage everyone that's online, listening, or tuning in to consider membership in the Florida Food Policy Council. We are a membership organization, a not-for-profit organization that's working for the good of the state of Florida in terms of its food policies and its food programs. So please do join us, and join us next month for the forum. Thank you all very much. Signing off now, and please do keep involved with our work.